Initial survey records recovered from Adeptus Mechanicus data vaults describe a sequence of fragmented pict captures, atmospheric readings, and surface AUSPEC scans gathered over several centuries of intermittent observation. These records do not begin with conquest or settlement, but with distant appraisal. Long-range survey vessels operating under Martian writ catalogued a world marked by persistent volcanic signatures, extreme thermal variance, and a planetary crust fractured by constant tectonic motion. The earliest logs describe a planet whose surface glowed intermittently from orbit, its nights broken by linear patterns of magma flow and industrial heat, long before full Mechanicus occupation was confirmed. Secondary evidence was gathered through indirect means. Rogue trader cartographs, pre-compliant stellar atlases, and recovered voidfarer testimony indicate that Ryza was known to early interstellar travelers as a hazardous but resource-rich system. Eyewitness accounts from this period are inconsistent in terminology but consistent in observation. The planet was described as loud even from high orbit, its electromagnetic emissions distorted by constant industrial activity or geothermal interference. No clear distinction could be made between natural and artificial heat sources. This ambiguity delayed formal classification, as early Mechanicus observers could not conclusively determine whether the world was already host to a functioning forge culture or merely possessed unusually violent geology. Archaeological data recovered much later suggests that human habitation on Ryza predates imperial reunification by many millennia. Fragmentary ruins located beneath later forge complexes indicate layered construction, with older habitation strata partially melted, reinforced or repurposed by subsequent industrial expansion. These findings imply a gradual transformation rather than a single founding event. There is no surviving record of a pristine pre-industrial Ryza. All known eras of habitation show evidence of metallurgy, plasma handling, and large-scale energy manipulation. This continuity would later become a defining characteristic of the world. Surface landings conducted during early mechanics expeditions reported an atmosphere thick with particular ash and metallic residue. Picked feeds from these landings show a sky permanently stained in hues of copper, red, and black, with cloud systems illuminated from below by the glow of furnaces and magma vents. Even regions distant from major population centers exhibited signs of artificial reinforcement. Lava flows were redirected through engineered channels. Mountain ranges were capped with heat sinks and venting spires. The planet appeared to resist categorization as either natural or constructed. The first confirmed inhabitants encountered by Imperial agents were not primitives, nor were they void-born colonists in the traditional sense. They were forge clans, organized into rigid labor hierarchies centered around manufactoria, plasma foundries, and reactor complexes. Physical descriptions compiled by early Meiji note that these populations exhibited extensive augmetic integration even at relatively young ages. Replacement limbs, reinforced skeletal structures, and neural interface ports were common. These modifications were not uniform, suggesting a long tradition of localized technological adaptation rather than standardized Martian implantation protocols. Demographic estimates from this period indicate a population already numbering in the billions prior to full Mechanicus annexation. Settlements were dense, vertically oriented, and clustered around thermal or industrial nodes. Social structure was utilitarian and rigid. Individuals were identified primarily by function rather than lineage. Clan affiliations were tied to specific production disciplines such as plasma containment, metallurgical refinement, or reactor maintenance. Education was practical and continuous, with knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship and direct neural imprinting rather than abstract scholastic institutions. Cultural records recovered from Ryza's earliest data crypts show a reverence for heat, pressure, and controlled destruction. These concepts were treated not as hazards, but as sacred tools. Ritualized maintenance cycles, sacrificial component testing, and ceremonial shutdowns formed the basis of communal life. These practices aligned closely enough with Mechanicus doctrine to allow for relatively seamless integration. though later analysis suggests that Ryza's traditions developed independently rather than as an offshoot of Martian orthodoxy. Contact with the wider Imperium formalized Ryza's status as a Forge world during the early Great Crusade. Unlike many such worlds, Ryza did not require extensive doctrinal re-education. Instead, it was incorporated through mutual recognition of shared technological priorities. Records from this era describe negotiations conducted between Martian emissaries and Ryzan Forge lords, focusing on production quotas, data sharing, and defense obligations rather than cultural compliance. The planet's output potential was immediately evident. The inhabitants themselves were physically shaped by their environment. Average height and mass measurements taken from Ryzan labor cohorts indicate a population adapted to high gravity and constant physical strain. Musculature was dense, bone structures reinforced either biologically or mechanically, and respiratory augmetics were common due to persistent atmospheric contamination. Skin pigmentation tended toward darker tones, often scarred or chemically altered by prolonged exposure to heat and industrial byproducts. Hair was typically cropped short or removed entirely to reduce contamination risk. Ocular augmetics were widespread, enhancing perception in low visibility and high glare environments. Despite these harsh conditions, Ryza supported a stable and self-sustaining population. Nutrient production was heavily industrialized, relying on protein reclamation, algae vats, and synthetic supplements. Traditional agriculture was minimal and confined to controlled environments beneath forge complexes. This reliance on manufactured sustenance further reinforced the population's acceptance of total industrial integration as a way of life rather than an imposition. Defense records from the late Great Crusade period indicate that Ryza rapidly became a critical supplier of plasma weaponry. This specialization was not arbitrary. Geological surveys revealed that the planet's crust was unusually rich in materials suited for plasma containment and high-energy conduction. Combined with Ryza's cultural familiarity with extreme heat management, this led to rapid innovation in plasma coil design, venting systems, and thermal stabilization. These advancements would later distinguish Ryzan plasma weapons from those produced on other Forge worlds. Military organization among the inhabitants followed Mechanicus norms but retained local characteristics. Skitarii legions raised on Ryza favored heavy thermal shielding and close-range engagement doctrines, reflecting their familiarity with confined high-heat environments. Early campaign records note their effectiveness in urban and subterranean combat zones, where plasma weaponry and environmental resilience provided a decisive advantage. As Ryza's integration deepened, its surface became increasingly stratified. Older habitation layers were sealed beneath newer forge plates, creating a planetary crust composed as much of alloy and ceramite as native stone. Entire mountain ranges were hollowed out to house reactors and manufactoria. Seismic activity, once a natural hazard, was gradually incorporated into the planet's energy infrastructure. Tectonic movement was monitored and exploited, with stress fractures used to vent excess heat or drive turbine systems. By the onset of the Horus Heresy, Ryza was firmly established as one of the Imperium's most productive Forge worlds. Its allegiance to Mars remained unbroken during that conflict, though records indicate periods of isolation due to warp disruption and strategic targeting by traitor forces. Even during these intervals, production did not cease. Autonomous Forge protocols and distributed command structures allowed the planet to continue supplying Loyalist forces with critical material. Survivor accounts from post-heresy assessments describe a world visibly scarred but functionally intact. Entire Forge regions were lost to orbital bombardment or internal overload, yet replacement complexes were already under construction. This pattern of destruction and renewal became a defining feature of Ryza's identity. Loss was treated as data. Failure was analyzed, recorded, and integrated into subsequent designs. Over the millennia that followed, Ryza's population continued to grow, its surface increasingly indistinguishable from its infrastructure. The concept of wilderness ceased to exist. Every region of the planet fell within some operational parameter, whether active production, energy generation or structural support. Even areas deemed inactive served as heat buffers or material reserves. In later Imperial records, Ryza is consistently described not as a planet that hosts forges, but as a forge that happens to occupy planetary scale. Its inhabitants are inseparable from its function. Individual identity is secondary to output, and survival is measured in continuity of production rather than preservation of landscape or tradition. This alignment of purpose has allowed Ryza to endure catastrophes that would have rendered lesser worlds uninhabitable. The cumulative evidence from archaeological strata, early survey logs, and continuous production records supports a single conclusion. Ryza was never discovered in a pristine state. It emerged into Imperial awareness already transformed by its inhabitants, shaped by generations who treated industry as environment and heat as heritage. The world did not adapt to becoming a Forge world. It had always been one in practice, awaiting formal recognition. The physical environment of Ryza cannot be separated from the industrial processes layered across its surface. Any attempt to describe its flora, fauna, geography, or meteorology must account for the fact that natural systems and artificial systems have been interwoven for millennia. What exists on Ryza today is not a preserved ecosystem, but a managed, constrained, and continuously modified planetary environment optimized for sustained forge activity. Geographically, Ryza is defined by extreme tectonic instability. The planet rests upon a fractured mantle marked by constant plate movement, widespread volcanism, and persistent seismic activity. Mountain ranges rise abruptly and without uniform pattern, many of them formed or reshaped by tectonic uplift rather than erosion. These ranges are rarely left untouched. Most have been hollowed out to house manufactoria, plasma reactors, or cooling chambers. External surfaces are reinforced with alloy cladding and stabilizer pylons to prevent collapse during seismic events. Large-scale natural plains are effectively non-existent. What might once have been open land has long since been converted into forge expanses, transport corridors, or energy relay fields. Where open ground does exist, it is often composed of vitrified rock, slag fields, or compacted industrial byproduct. These regions are not considered wastelands in the Ryzan context. They function as buffer zones for thermal discharge or controlled dump sites for inert waste materials. Subsurface geography is as important as the surface. Beneath Ryza's outer crust lies a vast network of tunnels, vaults, pressure chambers, and magma conduits. Some follow natural fault lines and lava tubes, while others are entirely artificial. Over time, the distinction between the two has become blurred. Natural magma flows are redirected into engineered channels, feeding heat exchangers and plasma furnaces. Caverns are reinforced, expanded, and repurposed, forming layered industrial zones that extend deep into the planetary mantle. Ryza's oceans, if they ever existed in a conventional sense, are no longer present as open bodies of water. Geological surveys indicate that early in the planet's history, surface water was either boiled away by geothermal activity or gradually consumed by industrial processes. What remains exists primarily in sealed reservoirs, subterranean aquifers, or heavily controlled recycling systems. These water sources are treated as strategic assets, monitored constantly for contamination and loss. The atmosphere of Ryza is dense, polluted, and in perpetual motion. It contains high concentrations of ash, metallic particulates, and chemically reactive gases produced by continuous forge output. Oxygen levels are maintained within survivable parameters through vast atmospheric processing systems distributed across the planet. These systems are essential to sustaining human life and are considered as critical as power generation or defense networks. Meteorologically, Ryza is dominated by heat-driven phenomena. Temperature variation between regions can be extreme, even across relatively short distances. Areas surrounding major forge complexes experience constant thermal uplift, creating localized storm systems characterized by violent winds, electrical discharge, and particulate precipitation. These storms are not seasonal. They are continuous, their intensity fluctuating in direct response to industrial output. Rainfall, where it occurs, is often acidic or metallic in composition. Liquid precipitation carries suspended ash and industrial residue, coating surfaces in corrosive films. As a result, exposed structures are treated with protective layers, and personnel operating outside sealed environments rely on environmental suits or implanted filtration systems. Lightning activity is frequent, driven by charged particulate clouds and heat differentials. This electrical activity is both a hazard and a resource, occasionally harvested through specialized collection arrays. Wind patterns on Ryza are largely artificial in origin. Massive ventilation towers, thermal exhaust spires, and pressure regulation systems create persistent directional airflow. These winds serve to disperse heat and prevent atmospheric stagnation, but can reach destructive velocities near major industrial zones. Entire districts are designed with aerodynamic considerations in mind, their architecture shaped to channel wind rather than resist it. Light conditions on the planet are heavily altered. Natural sunlight is often obscured by atmospheric haze, giving the sky a permanent dimness even during daylight hours. Illumination instead comes from below, provided by forge fires, plasma vents, and industrial lighting. At night, the planet's surface glows with a diffuse red and orange luminance visible from orbit. This constant low-light environment has influenced both architectural design and biological adaptation. Native flora on Ryza is extremely limited and highly specialized. Most plant life that once existed was eradicated or rendered extinct during early industrial expansion. What remains survives in controlled environments or in marginal zones where industrial activity is minimal. These organisms are typically heat-resistant, slow-growing, and capable of metabolizing minerals or industrial residue. Some lichenoid growths are found clinging to slag fields or rock faces near geothermal vents, drawing energy from chemical reactions rather than sunlight. These surviving plant analogues are not cultivated for aesthetic or ecological reasons. They are studied for potential industrial application, such as biofiltration, waste processing, or material synthesis. Any flora deemed inefficient or hazardous is eliminated. There is no concept of preservation for its own sake. Biological survival on Ryza is contingent upon utility. Fauna is even more scarce. Native animal life, where confirmed, exists almost entirely at the microbial or vermin scale. Extremophil organisms inhabit geothermal zones, feeding on chemical gradients and surviving temperatures lethal to unmodified humans. These lifeforms are of interest primarily to Mechanicus biologi, who analyze them for insights into resilience, metabolic efficiency, and potential applications in reactor maintenance or waste processing. Larger fauna is virtually non-existent outside of sealed environments. Any macroorganisms introduced by human settlement were either driven extinct, consumed, or deliberately eradicated as industrial expansion intensified. There are records of controlled biological reserves maintained beneath forge complexes, but these serve research purposes rather than conservation. Livestock in the traditional sense does not exist. Protein needs are met through synthetic production, recycled biomass, and vat-grown cultures. Human adaptation has effectively replaced native ecological balance. The population itself functions as the dominant biological presence on the planet, supported by extensive augmetic modification. Respiratory systems are reinforced or replaced to cope with particulate-laden air. Dermal layers are treated or augmented to resist chemical exposure. Sensory modifications allow individuals to function in low visibility and high radiation environments. These changes are considered routine rather than exceptional. Sound is a constant environmental factor on Ryza. The planet is rarely quiet. Low-frequency vibrations from machinery, tectonic movement, and atmospheric circulation permeate both surface and subsurface environments. Over time, structures and inhabitants alike have adapted to this persistent noise. Silence, where it exists, is confined to sealed sanctums or void-shielded chambers and is often described in records as unsettling rather than restful. Smell and taste are similarly affected. The air carries metallic, acidic, and sulfurous notes that permeate exposed areas. Nutritional intake is largely divorced from sensory pleasure. Food is engineered for efficiency and sustenance, often consumed in processed forms that minimize exposure to contaminants. Sensory enjoyment is secondary to function, and in many cases deliberately suppressed through chemical or neural regulation. Despite these conditions, Ryza maintains environmental stability through constant intervention. Planetary scale monitoring systems track atmospheric composition, tectonic stress, and thermal output in real time. Adjustments are made continuously, redirecting energy flows, venting excess heat, or reinforcing structural weak points. This active management prevents total environmental collapse, though it leaves no room for uncontrolled natural processes. The geography of Ryza is therefore not static. It changes incrementally as forge complexes expand, reactors are decommissioned, or geological stress necessitates restructuring. Maps are provisional documents, frequently updated to reflect new construction or subsurface modification. Entire regions may be reclassified over the course of decades, shifting from production zones to support infrastructure or vice versa. In this context, the concepts of wilderness, climate, and ecosystem are functional rather than descriptive. Ryza does not possess weather in the traditional sense. It experiences industrial atmospheric cycles. It does not host wildlife. It supports biological systems only insofar as they contribute to production or survival. Its geography is not shaped by erosion and growth, but by excavation, reinforcement, and replacement. Yet within these constraints, the planet persists as a stable forge environment. Its inhabitants understand its rhythms not as natural phenomena, but as operational parameters. Heat surges, ash storms, and seismic tremors are anticipated, measured, and incorporated into daily function. Adaptation is continuous and expected. Ryza endures not because it resists its environment, but because it has redefined what environment means. The planet exists in a state of perpetual industrial equilibrium, where geography serves machinery, meteorology serves energy regulation, and biology serves production. In this balance, fragile by conventional standards yet robust by design, the Forge world continues to operate at planetary scale. The historical record of Ryza is defined less by singular moments of transformation and more by sustained periods of pressure, endurance, and calculated response. From its formal incorporation into the Imperium onward, the Forge world functioned as a continuous producer of war material, its internal history closely tied to the wider conflicts of the galaxy. Unlike worlds whose identities were reshaped by conquest or catastrophe, Ryza's trajectory followed a pattern of reinforcement. Each major event tested existing systems, and each response resulted in further entrenchment of its industrial character. During the latter stages of the Great Crusade, Ryza was already recognized as a primary supplier of plasma weaponry to expeditionary fleets operating across multiple sectors. Mechanicus archives from this period emphasize consistency rather than innovation. Ryza's value lay in its ability to produce plasma arms at scale while maintaining lower rates of catastrophic failure than comparable Forge worlds. This reliability led to preferential distribution contracts, particularly with Legions Astartes formations that favoured plasma-based armaments. The outbreak of the Horus Heresy marked the first existential threat to Ryza's continued operation. Strategic analyses conducted by both loyalist and traitor forces identified the planet as a high-value target. However, unlike Forge worlds that became battlegrounds through internal schism, Ryza remained doctrinally aligned with Mars and the Imperium throughout the conflict. No verified evidence exists of large-scale tech heresy or allegiance shifts among its ruling magi. Despite this loyalty, Ryza did not escape the consequences of the war. Warp route instability and the collapse of nearby systems temporarily isolated the planet from centralized command structures. During this period, Ryza operated under autonomous production mandates, prioritizing stockpiling and self-defense. Records indicate that several attempted incursions were repelled by system defense fleets and ground-based Skitarii formations without external reinforcement. The most severe damage sustained during the Heresy era came not from direct invasion, but from orbital bombardment aimed at crippling production capacity. Several Forge regions were rendered inoperative following targeted strikes on plasma reactor clusters. Post-conflict assessments note that these losses were absorbed through rapid reconstruction rather than strategic withdrawal. Damaged zones were sealed, written off, and replaced with deeper, more heavily shielded facilities. This response established a precedent that would recur in later millennia. In the aftermath of the Heresy and throughout the Scouring, Ryza emerged as a stabilizing industrial node during a period of widespread Imperial reorganization. As many Forge worlds struggled to rebuild or redefine their output under new political structures, Ryza maintained continuity. Its existing specialization aligned well with the Imperium's ongoing military needs, particularly as plasma weaponry became increasingly standardized across Imperial forces. Throughout the following millennia, Ryza's history is punctuated by a series of localized crises rather than galaxy-shaping events. Reactor failures, tectonic collapses, and internal overloads are documented in great detail. These incidents are notable not for their rarity, but for their frequency. Ryza's environment ensured that such failures were inevitable. What distinguishes the planet's record is the absence of cascading collapse. Each incident resulted in controlled loss, followed by adaptive redesign. One of the most significant challenges faced by Ryza occurred during major Orc invasions that targeted Forge worlds across multiple sectors. Orc forces, drawn by the planet's industrial output and energy emissions, launched several large-scale assaults over different eras. These invasions resulted in prolonged surface engagements, particularly around Forge districts exposed by earlier expansion. Defensive records describe fighting conducted amid active production zones, with Manufactoria continuing operation while under siege. The response to these invasions further shaped Ryza's development. Defensive infrastructure was integrated directly into Forge architecture. Production lines were redesigned to allow rapid conversion to weapon assembly or defensive deployment. Civilian distinctions were further eroded, as the majority of the population was already embedded within military-industrial roles. Losses were significant, but replacement rates remained stable due to VAT-grown labour cohorts and continuous indoctrination. During the later stages of the Age of Apostasy, Ryza maintained operational distance from the political upheaval affecting much of the Imperium. While administrative oversight fluctuated, the planet's essential function insulated it from extreme intervention. Administratum records from this period show a tendency to defer to Mechanicus autonomy in matters concerning Ryza, prioritizing uninterrupted supply over doctrinal enforcement. This deference reinforced the planet's semi-independent operational culture. As the Imperium entered the latter half of the 41st millennium, Ryza faced renewed strategic pressure from multiple vectors. Increased demand for plasma weaponry during prolonged sector-wide conflicts placed strain on existing infrastructure. In response, Ryza expanded downward rather than outward. New forge strata were constructed deeper into the crust, closer to geothermal sources, increasing both output and risk. This expansion further destabilized the planet's geology, necessitating constant monitoring and reinforcement. Several notable reactor catastrophes during this period resulted in the permanent loss of entire Forge cities. In each case, the official response followed a familiar pattern. Affected zones were declared irrecoverable, sealed behind containment fields and reclassified as restricted strata. Data was extracted where possible. Surviving personnel were reassigned or recycled. Replacement capacity was brought online elsewhere. These events are recorded not as tragedies, but as statistical deviations within acceptable parameters. Throughout its history, Ryza has never experienced abandonment or total collapse. Even during periods of extreme loss, the planet's core systems have remained functional. This persistence has led to Ryza being cited in multiple Mechanicus treatises as a model of industrial resilience. However, these same sources acknowledge that such resilience comes at the cost of irreversible environmental degradation and escalating maintenance demands. The concept of a final fate for Ryza is therefore difficult to define in conventional terms. The planet has not been destroyed, consumed, or lost to the warp. It continues to exist, to produce, and to supply the Imperium. Yet long-term projections within Mechanicus archives suggest that Ryza's trajectory is finite. Each expansion into deeper strata increases the likelihood of catastrophic mantle breach. Each escalation in output compounds geological stress. Some projections estimate that, at current rates of exploitation, Ryza will eventually reach a point where containment systems can no longer compensate for tectonic instability. In such scenarios, outcomes range from partial planetary fragmentation to complete surface vitrification. These projections remain theoretical and are treated as long-term considerations rather than immediate threats. As with all things on Ryza, risk is weighed against output. Administratum records reflect a pragmatic acceptance of this trajectory. Ryza is classified not as a world to be preserved indefinitely, but as a resource to be utilized while viable. Contingency plans exist for data extraction, forge pattern relocation, and personnel redistribution should the planet become unsustainable. These plans are periodically updated but have never been enacted. From the perspective of its inhabitants, Ryza has no end state beyond continued function. The population does not conceive of a future in which the planet is anything other than a forge. There is no recorded cultural narrative of restoration or reclamation. Decline, if it occurs, will be managed in the same manner as any other failure. It will be measured, recorded, and addressed until further operation is no longer possible. As of the most recent verified records, Ryza remains active. Its surface continues to glow with industrial heat. Its forges continue to arm the Imperium's forces. Its population continues to adapt to conditions that would render most worlds uninhabitable. The planet stands as an example of sustained industrial existence pushed to planetary limits. Ryza's fate is not one of sudden annihilation or dramatic transformation. It is a gradual progression toward exhaustion, extended across millennia and measured in output rather than years. Until that threshold is reached, the Forge world persists, not as a place shaped by history, but as a mechanism through which history is armed and sustained. Imperial documentation concerning Ryza differs in tone and structure from records associated with less specialized worlds. From the perspective of both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus, Ryza is not approached as a conventional planetary holding, but as a strategic asset whose value is measured almost exclusively through continuity of function. This distinction is evident in the earliest joint records compiled after formal recognition of Ryza as a Forge world, and persists through subsequent millennia of bureaucratic and technocratic oversight. Administratum impressions of Ryza are shaped by scale and indispensability. Initial census attempts conducted during early Imperial integration were repeatedly revised, not due to population volatility in the traditional sense, but because Ryza's labour force could not be cleanly categorised. Large segments of the population existed in semi-autonomous forge cohorts, rotating between production cycles, maintenance duty, and combat readiness. Birth rates, mortality figures, and labour output were tracked, yet individual identification was often deprioritised in favour of aggregate productivity metrics. Administratum officials assigned to Ryza frequently noted that conventional civil registries were insufficient to describe a population so thoroughly integrated into industrial systems. As a result, administratum documentation procedures on Ryza evolved toward abstraction. Rather than enumerating individuals, records emphasized workforce mass, output efficiency, and replacement capacity. Population was treated as a renewable resource, sustained through controlled reproduction, vat-grown cohorts, and augmentation pipelines overseen by Mechanicus authorities. This approach was not contested, as Ryza's strategic importance outweighed concerns over civil classification norms. Administratum auditors routinely deferred to Mechanicus-provided datasets, recognizing that independent verification was both impractical and disruptive. The Adeptus Mechanicus, by contrast, approached Ryza with immediate doctrinal familiarity. From the outset, Mechanicus impressions emphasize compatibility. Ryza's pre-existing Forge culture aligned closely with Martian principles regarding labor sanctification, ritualized maintenance, and the primacy of function. Early Mechanicus envoys described the planet as already compliant in spirit, if not yet formally codified. This perception shaped subsequent documentation practices, which focused less on correction and more on integration. Mechanicus documentation of Ryza operates on multiple hierarchical layers. At the foundational level, continuous data streams record environmental metrics, production output, machine performance, and system degradation. These streams are not archived in static form, but maintained as living data constructs, constantly updated and cross-referenced. Only summarized extracts are transmitted to Mars or sector-level Forge authorities, while the full data mass remains planet-bound due to its volume and specificity. Above this layer, formal doctrinal records are maintained. These include treaty confirmations, production quotas, and technological classifications. Ryza's specialization in plasma weaponry is repeatedly reaffirmed in these documents, alongside restrictions governing the dissemination of proprietary designs. Notably, several plasma refinement techniques developed on Ryza are classified as restricted knowledge, shared only under direct Martian authorization. Administratum officials referencing these technologies do so indirectly, relying on Mechanicus descriptors rather than technical detail. Joint documentation procedures between the Administratum and Mechanicus are governed by long-standing protocols designed to minimize friction. On Ryza, these protocols are especially pronounced. Administratum representatives rarely conduct direct inspections of Forge complexes. Instead, inspections are simulated through data review, picked feed summaries, and performance audits compiled by Mechanicus adepts. These reports are standardized in format but flexible in content, allowing Ryza's ruling Magi to contextualize anomalies before they reach external review. Impressions recorded by Administratum personnel assigned to Ryza often reflect a sense of controlled exclusion. Officials describe access corridors that terminate abruptly, sealed vaults whose contents are listed only by reference code, and production halls visible only through filtered picked relays. This limited access is not perceived as obstruction, but as a necessary condition for maintaining output integrity. Administratum doctrine prioritizes supply reliability, and Ryza's consistent fulfillment of obligations reinforces tolerance for procedural opacity. The process of documenting Ryza's output follows a cyclical pattern. Production data is aggregated at the Forge level, consolidated at regional command nodes, and then abstracted into sector-wide reports. These reports emphasize delivery volume, failure rates, and logistical efficiency. Qualitative assessments of working conditions or environmental impact are minimal, included only when they directly affect production continuity. Over time, this has resulted in an Administratum archive that is extensive in numerical scope but limited in descriptive texture. Mechanicus records, while more detailed, are similarly selective. Ryza's internal documentation prioritizes machine lineage, component iteration, and failure analysis. Each Forge complex maintains its own data sanctums, where machine spirits are appeased through ritual logging and cyclical review. Deviations from expected performance are catalogued not as errors, but as data points contributing to long-term optimization. Human factors are recorded only insofar as they intersect with machine function. The act of documentation itself is ritualized on Ryza. Data entry, verification, and archival procedures are embedded within maintenance cycles and production rights. Adepts responsible for record keeping are trained not merely as scribes, but as interpreters of machine output. This integration blurs the distinction between observation and operation. To document a system is to interact with it, and to interact with it is to alter its state. Ryza's records therefore emphasize trend analysis over static snapshots. Discrepancies between Administratum and Mechanicus records are not uncommon, but they are rarely contested. Differences in reported figures are typically attributed to methodological variance rather than falsification. Administratum officials recognize that Mechanicus datasets often operate on scales and parameters outside standard Imperial frameworks. Conversely, the Mechanicus views Administratum requirements as simplified abstractions necessary for broader logistical coordination. On Ryza, these perspectives coexist without overt conflict. Periodic audits conducted under high-level Imperial authority provide rare moments of convergence. During such audits, joint teams review critical systems, focusing on strategic risk rather than doctrinal compliance. These reviews are tightly controlled and time-limited. Findings are summarized in sealed reports distributed to Mars, the Administratum High Lords, and relevant sector commands. Public dissemination is non-existent. Even within Ryza, access to audit conclusions is restricted to senior magi. The cumulative effect of these documentation practices is the construction of Ryza as an object of record rather than a lived environment. Administratum archives portray the planet as a stable node of production, defined by output curves and delivery schedules. Mechanicus archives depict it as an evolving machine system, characterized by iterative refinement and managed degradation. Neither perspective captures the totality of existence on Ryza, but together they form a functional representation sufficient for Imperial needs. Over millennia, this representation has become self-reinforcing. Ryza is documented as reliable, and therefore it is treated as reliable. Resources are allocated with the assumption of continued output. Contingencies are theoretical rather than immediate. This trust shapes both oversight intensity and response thresholds. Only deviations exceeding established tolerances trigger intervention, and even then, corrective measures prioritize restoration over re-evaluation. In suppressed marginalia within some Administratum records, there are indications of unease. References appear to escalating maintenance demands, increasing data abstraction, and growing reliance on automated reporting. These notes are rare and often flagged as speculative. They do not alter official classifications. Ryza remains designated as a primary Forge world in good standing, its documentation status unchanged. From a procedural standpoint, Ryza exemplifies the Imperium's approach to indispensable assets. Documentation exists not to question purpose, but to ensure continuity. Both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus engage with the planet through systems designed to translate complexity into manageable data. What cannot be easily quantified is either ignored or deferred. As a result, Ryza persists within Imperial records as a controlled constant. Its documentation evolves, its procedures refine, but its fundamental classification remains stable. The planet is not described in terms of potential futures or alternative trajectories. It is recorded as it is, measured by what it produces, and monitored only to the extent necessary to ensure that production does not cease. Geological analysis of Ryza occupies a central position within both Adeptus Mechanicus and Adeptus Administratum strategic evaluations. Unlike many Forge worlds whose industrial dominance is imposed upon otherwise stable planetary bodies, Ryza's value originates from its intrinsic geological volatility. The planet's physical instability is not treated as an obstacle to be mitigated, but as a resource to be measured, controlled, and exploited. Initial comprehensive geological surveys conducted following Ryza's formal integration revealed a crust unusually thin in multiple regions, fractured by extensive fault networks that extend deep into the mantle. Seismic mapping shows constant plate movement, with stress release occurring in near-continuous microquakes, rather than infrequent large-scale tectonic shifts. From an engineering standpoint, this pattern is considered advantageous. Predictable instability allows for managed energy extraction and structural reinforcement, whereas static geology carries the risk of sudden catastrophic release. The planetary mantle beneath Ryza exhibits abnormally high thermal output. Magma chambers are both numerous and shallow, creating a dense lattice of geothermal nodes accessible with relatively limited excavation. Adeptus Mechanicus analytics identify this configuration as ideal for sustained high-energy industrial operations. Plasma forge complexes are deliberately positioned near these nodes, minimizing energy transmission loss and reducing reliance on imported fuel sources. Over millennia, geological analytics have evolved from exploratory assessment to predictive modelling. Ryza is now mapped not only spatially, but temporally. Data engines track tectonic stress accumulation, magma flow velocity, crustal thinning, and material fatigue across planetary strata. These variables are fed into long-range projection systems designed to forecast structural viability decades or centuries in advance. Decisions regarding forge expansion or decommissioning are informed by these models rather than surface geography alone. One notable outcome of this approach is the deliberate sacrifice of certain regions. Geological models identify zones where continued operation would generate disproportionate risk. These zones are not abandoned immediately. Instead, they're exploited at maximum capacity until critical thresholds are approached. At that point, facilities are sealed, data is extracted, and the region is reclassified as inert or hazardous. This practice reflects Ryza's broader strategic philosophy. Geological exhaustion is acceptable so long as it is planned. Mineralogical surveys reveal that Ryza's crust is rich in conductive metals and rare alloys particularly suited for plasma containment and high energy transfer. Veins of heat-resistant materials, capable of withstanding repeated thermal cycling, are more abundant than on most surveyed forge worlds. These natural deposits reduce refinement overhead and contribute directly to Ryza's reputation for producing plasma weaponry, with lower failure rates. Mechanicus treatises repeatedly cite Ryza's native material composition as a foundational advantage that cannot be replicated through artificial means alone. Administratum strategic assessments emphasize this point when classifying Ryza's long-term value. Worlds that rely heavily on imported raw materials are vulnerable to supply disruption. Ryza's ability to source critical components locally insulates it from broader logistical instability. Even during periods of warp turbulence or sector-wide conflict, the planet retains baseline operational capacity. This resilience elevates Ryza's priority rating within Imperial supply frameworks. Geological analytics also inform Ryza's defensive planning. The same fault networks and subsurface voids that support energy extraction are incorporated into planetary defense systems. Subterranean void shields, hardened vaults, and deep storage arsenals are embedded within geologically stable pockets identified through continuous monitoring. Invasion scenarios modelled by the Adeptus Mechanicus consistently show that Ryza's most critical infrastructure is inaccessible without prolonged siege or extensive subterranean warfare, both of which favour the defenders. From a strategic standpoint, Ryza's location within established Imperial trade and military corridors further enhances its value. The planet occupies a position that allows efficient distribution of material across multiple sectors. Administratum logistics projections show that plasma weapons produced on Ryza can be delivered to frontline theatres with minimal transit delay relative to other major Forge worlds. This logistical efficiency amplifies the strategic impact of Ryza's production output beyond raw volume alone. The planet's geological instability also discourages certain categories of enemy engagement. Large-scale planetary invasion forces face inherent risk operating on Ryza's surface. Unpredictable seismic activity, extreme heat zones, and industrial hazards complicate deployment and supply. Enemy forces lacking detailed geological intelligence are particularly vulnerable. Mechanicus simulations demonstrate that even successful landings often result in unsustainable attrition before meaningful disruption of production can occur. Despite these advantages, internal analytics acknowledge escalating long-term risk. Each additional layer of excavation weakens structural integrity. Each new forge stratum introduces additional thermal and seismic load. Geological models predict increasing frequency of mantle breaches if expansion continues unchecked. These projections are carefully documented but framed as deferred concerns. Strategic doctrine prioritizes present necessity over future uncertainty. Administratum classifications reflect this calculus. Ryza is designated as a high-value, high-risk asset. its continued operation is considered essential to Imperial military readiness, particularly in conflicts requiring plasma saturation capabilities. Contingency planning focuses on output preservation rather than planetary preservation. Should geological instability reach critical levels, plans emphasize extraction of forge templates, data cores, and skilled personnel rather than attempts at planetary stabilization. Some suppressed Mechanicus analyses speculate on extreme end-state scenarios. These include partial planetary collapse resulting in segmented forge continents, or complete surface vitrification rendering habitation impossible while leaving deep core forges operational for limited durations. Such scenarios are categorized as low probability but inevitable if current trends persist. They remain confined to restricted data vaults and do not influence official production mandates. In practical terms, Ryza's geological condition reinforces its strategic role. The planet is treated as a consumable engine of war. Its value lies in its ability to convert geological volatility into controlled industrial output. So long as this conversion remains efficient, escalation of risk is considered acceptable. The combined geological analytics and strategic assessments present Ryza as a world operating within a narrowing margin. Stability is maintained not through equilibrium, but through constant intervention. Every seismic tremor, every thermal surge, is logged and incorporated into decision-making processes. Failure is anticipated but localized. Collapse is acknowledged but postponed. Within Imperial strategic frameworks, this posture is sufficient. Ryza is not expected to endure indefinitely. It is expected to endure long enough. As long as its geology continues to yield energy, material and tactical advantage, its strategic value outweighs the cost of its gradual degradation. The planet remains classified as indispensable, its geological instability not a liability, but the foundation of its continued relevance. Assessments of Ryza's remaining potential are framed not in terms of untapped abundance, but in terms of continued yield under intensifying constraints. Both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus approach the question of possible resources with the assumption that Ryza has already passed through multiple phases of peak exploitation. What remains is not discovery in the exploratory sense, but refinement, recovery, and extraction from increasingly marginal conditions. From a resource standpoint, Ryza continues to offer materials of strategic relevance, though most are no longer accessed through conventional mining. Primary mineral veins have long since been exhausted or rendered inaccessible by structural instability. Current extraction focuses on secondary and tertiary sources. These include deep mantle deposits accessed through controlled magma displacement, slag reclamation from historical forge layers, and material recovery from decommissioned infrastructure. Entire strata of obsolete manufactoria are periodically dismantled, their components refined and reintroduced into production cycles. One of the most significant resource categories on Ryza is thermal energy itself. The planet's geothermal output remains vast, though increasingly volatile. Heat is harvested not only as a power source, but as an input for material transformation processes that would be prohibitively expensive elsewhere. High-temperature plasma furnaces on Ryza operate closer to theoretical tolerances than those on more stable worlds, allowing for experimental alloys and containment techniques that rely on extreme conditions. Administratum logistics assessments consistently note that such processes would be impractical without Ryza's inherent geological support. Rare conductive alloys continue to be recovered, though often in fragmented or mixed form. Mechanicus analytics indicate that these materials are most efficiently obtained through large-scale recycling rather than fresh extraction. Slag fields and vitrified rock layers, once considered waste, are now treated as resource reserves. Advanced separation techniques allow trace elements to be isolated and recombined, extending the effective lifespan of Ryza's material base. This approach aligns with broader Imperium-wide trends toward total resource utilization. In addition to physical materials, Ryza offers substantial scientific research value. The planet functions as a live environment for studying long-term industrial stress at planetary scale. Mechanicus research cadres analyze system degradation, machine spirit behavior under extreme conditions, and the interaction between geological instability and artificial infrastructure. Data gathered from Ryza informs design protocols applied across other Forge worlds, particularly in the construction of high-output plasma reactors and reinforced manufactoria. One area of particular interest is failure management. Ryza provides extensive empirical data on controlled collapse. Systems are deliberately pushed to operational limits, monitored through failure, and redesigned based on observed outcomes. This iterative process generates knowledge that cannot be replicated through simulation alone. Mechanicus scholars reference Ryza frequently in treatises on acceptable loss, redundancy planning, and sacrificial architecture. The planet's history of localized catastrophe without systemic failure is considered a valuable case study. Biological research also benefits indirectly from Ryza's environment. Extremophiles organisms adapted to geothermal zones and industrial contamination are studied for potential application in waste processing, reactor maintenance, and atmospheric filtration. While these organisms are not cultivated at scale, their biochemical properties contribute to broader Mechanicus understanding of resilience and adaptation. Administratum records mention such research only obliquely, categorizing it under general technological advancement rather than biological study. From the Adeptus Administratum perspective, the evaluation of Ryza's resources and research benefits is ultimately utilitarian. The planet is assessed based on its contribution to imperial stability and military readiness. Continued output of plasma weaponry remains the primary metric. Secondary benefits such as technological advancement or data generation are acknowledged but treated as ancillary. Administratum final analyses consistently conclude that Ryza's continued operation is justified, so long as its output offsets the increasing costs of maintenance and oversight. Strategic resource planning documents reflect cautious acceptance of diminishing returns. Ryza is no longer expected to expand its contribution indefinitely. Instead, it is expected to maintain a high baseline of specialized output for as long as feasible. Administratum contingencies focus on gradual transition rather than abrupt replacement. Alternate Forge worlds are identified to assume portions of Ryza's production should capacity decline, but none are currently positioned to replicate its full specialization. The Adeptus Mechanicus final analysis adopts a more granular and doctrinal tone. Ryza is viewed as a convergent system nearing advanced operational maturity. Its value lies not only in what it produces, but in what it demonstrates. The planet embodies the principle that total industrial integration can be sustained under extreme conditions through continuous adaptation. Mechanicus authorities regard Ryza as a proving ground for doctrines related to endurance, redundancy, and managed decay. At the same time, Mechanicus internal assessments do not ignore the planet's limitations. Projections acknowledge that each successive generation of infrastructure is more complex to maintain than the last. Machine spirits exhibit increasing idiosyncrasy as systems age and are repeatedly modified. Data coherence requires escalating levels of intervention. These factors are documented as challenges rather than deterrents. Complexity itself is treated as a form of knowledge. In combined Administratum and Mechanicus syntheses, Ryza is classified as a world operating within a closing operational window, but one that remains far from obsolescence. Its resource base is diminishing, yet not exhausted. Its research value is increasing, even as its physical stability declines. This inverse relationship reinforces its strategic importance in the present era. Final recommendations emphasize continued exploitation paired with comprehensive data extraction. Every process, failure, and adaptation is to be recorded and transmitted where possible. The assumption underpinning these recommendations is that even Ryza's eventual decline will generate knowledge of enduring value. The planet's long history of industrial stress makes it uniquely suited to inform future Forge world design and crisis management. In conclusion, Ryza is not evaluated as a sustainable world in the ecological or cultural sense. It is evaluated as a functional engine whose remaining lifespan must be maximized through calculated use. The Adeptus Administratum accepts this reality with pragmatic restraint, focusing on supply continuity and risk mitigation. The Adeptus Mechanicus accepts it with doctrinal resolve, viewing Ryza as both a resource and a lesson. As long as Ryza continues to convert instability into output and data, both institutions consider its continued operation justified. Preservation is not the objective, utility is. Within that framework, the Forge world remains not only viable, but indispensable, its remaining resources and accumulated knowledge reinforcing its role at the heart of the Imperium's industrial and military apparatus. Artifacts recovered on Ryza are rarely encountered in isolation. Unlike archaeological finds on abandoned worlds, discoveries on Ryza are typically embedded within active infrastructure, uncovered incidentally during expansion, collapse, or replacement of existing systems. As a result, the line between artifact and component is often indistinct. Many objects classified as artifacts were, at the time of discovery, still partially functional, integrated into systems whose original design lineage could no longer be conclusively traced. Inquisition involvement in artifact assessment on Ryza is usually initiated at the request of the Adeptus Mechanicus rather than through independent discovery. This procedural detail is significant. Mechanicus authorities on Ryza are generally confident in their ability to identify and classify technology within accepted doctrinal boundaries. Requests for Inquisition oversight therefore indicate uncertainty exceeding internal tolerances. Such cases are rare, but consistently associated with deep strata excavations, or the dismantling of legacy forge layers predating full Imperial integration. Several recorded artifacts are described as infrastructural cores whose materials or internal geometries do not correspond to known standard template construct derivations. These cores are often found fused into bedrock, their outer layers indistinguishable from surrounding geology. Auspex analysis reveals internal symmetry and energy flow patterns inconsistent with natural formation. In all documented cases, these structures are inert at the time of discovery, though residual energy signatures persist long after isolation. Inquisition records note that Mechanicus adepts initially classified some of these finds as anomalous Martian offshoot designs, or heavily modified human constructs. Subsequent analysis failed to confirm these assessments. The absence of clear provenance triggered escalation to Ordo-level review. In each instance, access was restricted and further investigation proceeded under joint authority. Outcomes varied, but none resulted in public classification or dissemination. Another category of artifact involves data-bearing systems. During the reclamation of collapsed data sanctums, recovery teams have occasionally identified storage matrices encoded in formats incompatible with known Mechanicus Lex mechanic protocols. These matrices resist direct decryption, often requiring physical isolation to prevent interference with surrounding systems. Inquisition cipher specialists assigned to these cases report that the data does not behave as corrupted or encrypted material, but as structured information operating under unknown logical frameworks. In at least 2 sealed cases, attempts to interface with such matrices resulted in cascading data instability across nearby systems. Machine spirits exhibited erratic responses, severing connections autonomously and initiating containment protocols without direct command input. These reactions were interpreted by Mechanicus authorities as defensive responses to incompatible data states, rather than evidence of malign influence. Nevertheless, the affected artifacts were removed from active zones and transferred to sealed vaults under Inquisition seal. Censorship surrounding these discoveries is extensive. Official Mechanicus records typically reclassify affected sites as structurally compromised or technologically obsolete, citing routine decommissioning as the cause of access restriction. Administratum summaries omit reference to artifacts entirely, focusing instead on production loss and subsequent replacement. Only Inquisition archives retain detailed accounts, and even these are frequently fragmented, distributed across multiple Ordo data vaults to prevent comprehensive reconstruction without authorization. Knowledge suppression on Ryza follows a consistent pattern. Information deemed potentially destabilizing is not destroyed but partitioned. Technical specifics are separated from contextual discovery data. Sensor readings are archived independently from eyewitness testimony. Physical artifacts are stored under conditions that prevent further study without reassembly of multiple authorization chains. This approach reflects Inquisition doctrine, favoring containment over eradication when threat classification remains ambiguous. Certain censored findings pertain not to physical objects but to processes. In one long-running investigation, Inquisition observers documented a forge complex whose plasma containment efficiency exceeded known theoretical limits despite operating with ostensibly standard components. Repeated inspection failed to identify illicit modification. Over time, the complex exhibited gradual divergence from documented schematics, though no individual change exceeded acceptable variance. When the anomaly was formally acknowledged, the forge was quietly dismantled, its components redistributed, and its performance data sealed. In this case, the artifact was not a discrete object, but an emergent system behavior. Mechanicus explanations attributed the phenomenon to cumulative micro-optimizations guided by long-trained machine spirits. Inquisition analysts noted that similar emergent behaviors are occasionally associated with prohibited autonomous systems. Lacking definitive evidence, the matter was classified as unresolved and censored from wider dissemination. Ryza's age further complicates artifact classification. Continuous reconstruction means that older systems are rarely preserved intact. When fragments survive, they often do so in altered form, fused with newer materials or repurposed into structural elements. This makes definitive dating difficult. Some recovered components display wear patterns inconsistent with their estimated operational lifespan, suggesting either extreme longevity or incomplete understanding of their original function. There are also records of artifacts that were deliberately left in place. In a small number of cases, Inquisition review concluded that removal would pose unacceptable risk to planetary stability. Such artifacts were instead isolated, shielded, and incorporated into containment architectures. Their existence is acknowledged only through reference codes, with no descriptive data attached in accessible records. The rationale provided emphasizes risk minimization rather than doctrinal acceptance. Censored knowledge on Ryza extends beyond technology to include historical gaps. Inquisition chronologies identify several periods where documentation density drops sharply without corresponding evidence of catastrophe. These gaps are not attributed to data loss from war or disaster. Instead, they appear to result from intentional archival omission. Mechanicus authorities cite data triage during high output phases as justification. Inquisition analysts remain unconvinced but lack grounds for formal challenge. Eyewitness testimony relating to artifacts is treated with particular caution. Personnel involved in discovery events are routinely reassigned, subjected to memory screening, or integrated into long-term off-world deployments. Official justification frames this as contamination control and psychological safeguarding. Inquisition marginalia note that this practice effectively prevents accumulation of corroborating accounts over time. Despite these measures, certain patterns persist across censored cases. Artifacts tend to be associated with deep thermal zones, extreme geological stress, and infrastructure layers predating standardized Martian oversight. They rarely exhibit overt Xenos characteristics, yet do not conform cleanly to known human technological lineages. No artifact recovered on Ryza has been conclusively identified as alien in origin, nor conclusively human. Inquisition consensus does not classify Ryza as an archaeological threat world. However, it is recognized as a site where prolonged industrial continuity has preserved technological residues that elsewhere would have been erased by collapse or abandonment. This continuity increases the probability of encountering legacy systems whose implications are not fully understood. As a result, Ryza occupies a unique position in Inquisition knowledge management doctrine. It is not a repository of forbidden lore by design, but it has become one by circumstance. Knowledge is not suppressed because it is overtly heretical. but because its interpretation could destabilize existing doctrinal frameworks or provoke unnecessary intervention. The prevailing Inquisition approach is therefore conservative. Artifacts are catalogued, isolated and rendered inert where possible. Knowledge is fragmented and sealed. Investigation proceeds only when risk escalation is indicated. Ryza continues to operate, its deeper layers holding traces of forgotten design decisions and unresolved origins. What lies beneath Ryza's accumulated infrastructure is not a singular hidden truth, but a stratified accumulation of unanswered questions. The Inquisition does not seek to resolve them all. It seeks only to ensure that they remain contained, recorded, and prevented from influencing the present in ways the Imperium cannot control. Picked feed material originating from Ryza forms a distinct category within Inquisition archives. Unlike battlefield footage or compliance-era surveys, these records are not centered on singular events. They are continuous, procedural, and often mundane in isolation. It is only through aggregation that patterns emerge. The majority of picked feeds reviewed by Inquisition analysts were not generated for investigative purposes. They were captured incidentally through industrial monitoring systems, maintenance oversight relays, and automated safety audits embedded within Forge infrastructure. Visual data consistently depicts environments of extreme density and scale. Forge halls extend beyond frame limits, their depth obscured by particulate haze and heat distortion. Movement within these spaces appears synchronized, with labor units advancing in regulated intervals rather than individual discretion. In many feeds, no clear distinction can be made between human operators and machine components at distance. Augmetic integration and environmental shielding render silhouettes uniform, reinforcing earlier observations of reduced individual variance. Several picked feeds flagged for Inquisition review show transitional moments rather than active crisis. Reactor shutdowns conducted under emergency protocols, bulkhead closures during seismic events, and controlled venting of plasma overflow recur frequently. In these sequences, personnel response is notably consistent. There is minimal evidence of panic or improvisation. Movements remain within predefined pathways. Deviations, when they occur, are subtle and rapidly corrected. Of particular interest are feeds recorded during structural failures later classified as catastrophic. In multiple instances, visual data shows continued operational behavior within zones later declared irrecoverable. Personnel are observed completing tasks, sealing conduits, or transferring materials in conditions that retrospective analysis suggests were already unsustainable. These sequences often terminate abruptly, either due to signal loss or deliberate feed cessation. Official annotations describe these terminations as system failures. Inquisition marginalia occasionally question the timing. Audio components of picked feeds add another layer of complexity. Beyond the constant mechanical resonance, analysts have identified recurring low-frequency patterns that do not correlate directly with known machinery cycles. These sounds are not present in all feeds, nor are they localized to a single region. When noted, they are typically dismissed as harmonic interference or environmental resonance. However, their recurrence across centuries of recordings has resulted in restricted tagging rather than elimination from archives. Eyewitness testimonials gathered by the Inquisition are limited by design. Personnel selected for interview are typically mid-level functionaries rather than senior magi or unaugmented labourers. Testimonies are conducted under controlled conditions, often off-world, following reassignment or recovery from major incidents. The stated objective is to assess cognitive integrity and doctrinal compliance rather than to solicit narrative detail. These testimonials display a high degree of uniformity. Descriptions of events are factual, concise, and framed in procedural language. Emotional qualifiers are rare. When prompted to elaborate on personal experience, respondents frequently redirect to system behavior or task completion. Phrases indicating individual perception are often replaced with references to operational parameters. This pattern is consistent across interviews conducted centuries apart. In several cases, Inquisition interrogators attempted to probe memory gaps surrounding high-fatality events. Responses typically acknowledge loss without elaboration. When pressed, witnesses describe their actions in sequence until a point of discontinuity, after which they reference reassignment, recovery, or data loss. Psychological valuation classifies this as conditioned response rather than trauma-induced amnesia. No evidence of psychic interference has been detected. A smaller subset of testimonials originates from non-mechanicus Imperial personnel, including void crew, administratum envoys, and attached military units temporarily stationed on Ryza. These accounts introduce greater variability. Several describe a persistent sense of spatial disorientation when operating within forge complexes, particularly in deep strata. Corridors are described as repeating or converging in ways that defy expected layout logic, despite consistent cartographic data. One recurring observation from these external witnesses involves perceived changes in environmental scale. Individuals report sections of infrastructure appearing closer or farther than anticipated, or traversal times fluctuating without corresponding changes in distance. These perceptions are not supported by sensor data and are attributed to environmental stress, fatigue, or augmented sensory mismatch. Nonetheless, the consistency of such reports across unrelated personnel has warranted archival retention. Inquisition picked feed reviews also include footage captured during sanctioned inspections of restricted zones. These feeds are heavily redacted, but unaltered versions preserved in sealed archives show environments markedly different from upper forge layers. Lighting is minimal and often indirect. Surfaces appear continuous, with fewer visible seams between structural elements. In some recordings, the absence of identifiable machinery creates an impression of stillness uncommon elsewhere on the planet. In these zones, motion sensors occasionally register activity without corresponding visual confirmation. Such discrepancies are logged as sensor error. However, in several instances, feed annotations indicate that manual verification was inconclusive. No hostile presence was identified. No further action was taken. Final Inquisition thoughts on Ryza are consolidated through periodic review synopses rather than singular verdicts. Across these documents, a consistent assessment emerges. Ryza does not present an active threat to Imperial stability. It shows no confirmed signs of Xenos infiltration, warp corruption, or doctrinal subversion. Its output remains reliable. Its loyalty, as measured through compliance and supply fulfillment, is intact. At the same time, Ryza is not fully transparent. Its depth, both literal and procedural, exceeds the capacity of conventional oversight. Layers of infrastructure and history overlap to the point where origin, function, and adaptation blur together. The planet's systems exhibit behaviors that are explainable in isolation but ambiguous in aggregate. These ambiguities do not escalate, they persist. From an Inquisition perspective, this persistence is key. Ryza does not produce anomalies that grow, spread, or destabilize. Instead, it produces anomalies that remain bounded. They recur without intensifying. They resist categorization without breaching thresholds. This pattern places Ryza in a classification space defined not by danger, but by incompleteness of understanding. Inquisition doctrine does not require total understanding to permit continued operation. It requires manageable risk. In this context, Ryza is considered manageable. Surveillance remains intermittent rather than continuous. Investigations remain targeted rather than comprehensive. Knowledge is archived rather than disseminated. Final recommendations emphasize continued observation at depth without escalation. Picked feed sampling from lower strata is to be maintained. Eyewitness interviews are to continue following major incidents, with emphasis on detecting deviation rather than explanation. Artifact encounters are to follow established containment protocols. No expansion of authority is advised absent new indicators. In closing, the Inquisition does not regard Ryza as a mystery to be solved. It regards it as a system to be watched. The planet's value to the Imperium constrains action, but it also provides context. Ryza has functioned for millennia under conditions that would have destroyed lesser worlds. Its anomalies have not altered that outcome. What remains unexplainable on Ryza is not treated as forbidden knowledge, but as deferred understanding. It is catalogued, sealed, and revisited when necessary. Until such time as ambiguity becomes instability, the Forge world remains under observation, its forges burning, its depths silent, and its unanswered questions preserved within the archives rather than acted upon. From the Inquisition's perspective, this is sufficient.